Well, good morning, and thank you for being here again. Some of you may not be as familiar with me as you are with other staff members. I am Jeff Scott, and I have been on staff for 12 years now. I was the youth minister and the college minister. I've been serving the past almost 2 years as your education minister, and this is the first time I've ever had the privilege to preach in celebration worship. I'm going to try not to blow it. That's my goal this morning. I have, maybe more than anyone on staff, filled in for John Witten while he was on family vacation over the last 12 years. He and I have served together. It just used to be on the other end of the block. But I am grateful to be with you today as we continue the series on questions from God. And we're going to ask the question today, what is that to you? Which will be fun to unpack here in just a little bit. When we think of, and when I mention, the greatest sports rivalries, what comes to your mind? Now, when I was thinking through this earlier, the first thing that came to my mind was the Dallas Cowboys and the now Washington football team. They changed their name a couple years ago. We've had a lot of run-in with those guys, and I don't generally care for them at all as a lifelong Cowboys fan. And I remember Dr. Reed, the Dave Campo era Dallas Cowboys, not our brightest spot in history. The oldest rivalry in the NFL, the Green Bay Packers and the Chicago Bears. They have played more than any other two teams. Baseball, we think of the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees. Historical NBA, the Los Angeles Lakers, and again, the Boston Celtics. In college, Ohio State, Michigan. In college basketball, Duke, North Carolina, PGA golf, Jack Nicklaus, Arnold Palmer, Tiger and Phil. Closer to home, the University of Texas. And remember when they used to play a school called Texas A&M? Those were good days. Maybe OU is their big rival now. The rivalries are great, and we love them. It is just a constant comparison. Who is better? You know, it doesn't mean you have to hate one another. Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer were very good friends, but highly competitive with each other. Now, as a college student, south of here in Brownwood at Howard Payne, we thought Hardin-Simmons was our rival. Until it was very painful when I realized they didn't care about us at all. It was an embarrassing thing for me. We're rivals like hammer and nails, I guess, or rivalries. Not great at that point. I will say back then we were a little more competitive than we are today. But all we can ask for is equal playing field. No home cooking from refs. Just let it be a fair game. That's really what we want in life too, isn't it? Just fair. Can it just be fair? A fair and level playing field? We compare ourselves to others and we don't want them to have something we don't have. It should be fair. I had an older brother growing up, and we always wanted things to be fair. Can you relate to that? Do you remember when you were a child growing up? How about with your kids, your grandkids? How much time do we spend trying to keep things fair? How many times a week do you hear the words, hey, that's not fair? I jotted some down from my own personal experience here. That's not fair. They get to stay up so late. Why can I can't stay up as late as them? How about, it's not fair. They already have a phone. Everyone I know already has a phone. It's not fair. I have to take out the trash again. It's his turn. Why do I have to have apple slices in my lunch? They get cookies. It's not fair. Life's not fair. I don't know if it makes you feel any better, but I don't think this is a new concept. I believe you can go all the way back to the very first sin, Adam and Eve, that was ever committed, was based on the complaint of, hey, that's not fair. Do you remember the story? God knows the difference between good and evil, and I don't. I want to be like God. That's not fair. And they ate the fruit. So I had recently taken an intentionally long time to read through the Gospel of John. I went at a really slow pace, rereading lots of these familiar stories that we all know. We've heard them many times before, but I wanted to read them with fresh eyes. Pay attention to new details, things we might have missed, emotions that were felt by these characters. And if you haven't read the Bible that way, or you haven't done that in a while, I would encourage you to do that. I can get caught up in I'm trying to get through certain chapters and trying to keep a pace going. And sometimes, though, it's good just to slow down. Ask God to open your eyes as you reread some of these very familiar texts. And one of the things that I picked up on was this very unique relationship between Peter and John. And I've come to the conclusion that Peter and John loved each other like brothers, which means they probably argued. We're pretty sure they might have been jealous of each other at times. And we know from the New Testament accounts that Jesus was very close with these two men. But who was his favorite? You have on one hand Peter, the rock on which Jesus says he will build his church. The preacher at Pentecost. Peter. On the other hand, you have John, the disciple Jesus loved. The disciple Jesus entrusted the care of his mother to in his last moments. Who would you rather be? The one Jesus mentored to become the leader of the early church, or the one not so much known by his actions, nearly as much as he's known by his relationships? Two very different men. And according to Matthew, we know Peter and his brother Andrew, they were the first two called, and then it was John and his brother James. So John and Peter had been with Jesus from the beginning. They were always with him. Can you imagine, knowing what we know, how mad Peter was when word got back to the disciples that James and John had requested to sit at the right hand and left hand of Jesus when he comes in his glory? I would imagine that was quite a scene. Why do you think that is? Because I'm sure the disciples like, hey, that's not, what's the word? Fair. Why them? Why not me? I also find this interesting. John makes 4 subtle, not so subtle jabs at Peter when we read his gospel. John wants his reader to know in chapter 13 at the Last Supper that he was the one sitting next to Jesus. And when Jesus announced that one of the 12 was going to betray him, and all the disciples began to ask, that Peter was a little afraid to ask Jesus, and so he motions to John, hey, you ask. It's a funny detail to include. John could have just said, and I asked, or the disciple whom Jesus loved, great name to call yourself, asked, but he didn't. He wants us to know Peter was scared. Chapter 18, Jesus has been arrested. He's been taken to the high priest. John was the one who was acquainted with the high priest, and John would like you, the reader, to know that he's the one that went and let Peter in the gate. Peter wasn't in the inner circle. He let him in. My favorite probably is in chapter 20, after the resurrection, when Peter and John, they run to the tomb. And in 4 verses, John lets you know twice that he outran Peter. He's faster. Verses 8 and 4, he tells us that. And then in chapter 21, the disciples are out fishing. And Jesus suggests, if you remember the story, cast your nets on the other side. And there are so many fish, they couldn't raise the nets. And we remember, Peter jumped out of the boat and swam to shore to be with Jesus. But what can often be overlooked is John lets you know he told Peter, hey, that's Jesus. He's the one that recognized him. Funny details to include when telling a story. And the reason I bring them up is I think it confirms for us that these two guys had a bit of a rivalry. And we need to acknowledge it. They compared themselves and they wanted things to be fair. And that gets us to our text for the day and the question that Jesus asks us. So in John 21, after the fishing story we just talked about, the scene, Jesus, he's cooked breakfast for his disciples. They're on the shore there eating. And Jesus takes his opportunity to reinstate Peter. If you remember that story, 3 times Peter denied Jesus. 3 times he asks him, do you love me? Then feed my sheep. It's a great story. And in verse 18, Peter gets some, what you could say, difficult news to hear. He receives his final commands from Christ, and it's the last recorded conversation between Peter and Jesus. And in my mind, breakfast is complete. They're sitting around, and Peter and Jesus get up, and they kind of just begin walking down the shore. John, not wanting to be left out, following behind, eavesdropping, wanting to hear what's being said. So let's stand together as we read John 21, verses 18 through 22. It says, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said, "Follow me." And Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This is the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" And Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Thank you. You may be seated. I think Jesus, maybe like a parent of a couple of young boys, maybe a couple of brothers, is a little fed up with this rivalry and this constant comparison and this competitiveness with these two. Peter wants to know, what about John? Is it going to be fair? How's it going to be for him? And Jesus responds with a very firm question. And that's the question he continues to ask us today. What about you? Maybe my own translation, what do you care? What's that matter to you? That's not your business. You're focused on the wrong thing. Don't worry about him. You follow me. Jesus has just gone through this moment of reinstating Peter. Just given him all this new mission and this very important news for him to hear. And Peter's first thought is, what about him? He wants to compare his future with John's. And I think we can be guilty of the same thing. We compare ourselves with other people. We wonder why they have what they have. Why don't we get to have these things? Why do they get to live in that house? Why do they get to drive that vehicle? It's not fair. Why do I have to have this diagnosis? Why does my kid struggle so much in school? That's not fair. It's not fair my spouse had an affair. It's not fair my parents got divorced. I lost my job. That's not fair. They get to go to a mission trip. I can't afford that. Life's hard. God, why isn't it fair? Jesus says to you and he says to me this morning, what is that to you? But you follow me. If we look at Peter, we can compare his obedience. When he was in the garden with Jesus and the guards showed up, the soldiers are there to arrest him, he, a fisherman, pulls out a sword and is ready to do battle and fight with these highly skilled and trained soldiers. We move forward a couple hours. Jesus has been taken. And now Peter, who is willing to fight an army, is denying Jesus to young girls and to servants. We can fast forward, though, a few weeks. And now we're into Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. Time waiting's over and the Holy Spirit has filled the place. And Peter, boldly, without hesitation, preaches Christ openly in the very city where Jesus had been arrested and murdered. And this boldness stayed with him throughout the rest of his life. I really think he thought in the garden, when the soldiers showed up, as long as I'm in the presence of Jesus, I cannot lose. And then after receiving the Spirit, he understood. He understood what Jesus commanded him that day on the beach. He was filled with the Spirit of God. Peter, now willing to go and do whatever God wanted him to do. He didn't care who else was going. He didn't care now how fair things were. Jesus said, follow me, and he did. You know, that wasn't the first time Peter heard Jesus say something like, "Follow me." In John 14, verses 23 and 24, Jesus says this, "Anyone who loves me will obey my teaching, and my Father will love them, and he will come to them and make our home with them. Anyone who does not love me will not obey my teaching. These words you hear are not my own. They belong to the Father who sent me." Jesus asked Peter, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" And after 3 times Peter confesses he does, Jesus affirms as his final instruction to Peter what he says here. "Because you say you love me, follow me." See, the key to God's heart, I really think it's not humility, it's not perseverance or faith. These are key attributes that play a huge role in the Christian's life. But this passage reveals to us the key to God's heart. Jesus plainly tells us the best way to express our love, honor, reverence for God is through obedience. The key to God's heart here, obedience. Obedience is not an option for Christians. And Jesus simply just states that as fact. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. He's not giving an option for obedience. Take note, he doesn't say, if you love me, then when you feel like it, when you're tired of doing your own thing, follow me. He says that the person who truly loves him will obey his commandments. So for the believer, there is no option. He loves Jesus. Therefore, he obeys his commands. It means we follow them and we treasure them. In 1 John, he writes, "We know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. Whoever says, 'I know him,' but does not do what he commands is a liar, and the truth is not in that person." It says here that there is a test. Would you like to know if you love Jesus? Would you like to know if you're a follower of Jesus? Do you truly love Jesus? The question is, well, do you obey his commands? If we want to have a relationship with him, obedience should be the priority in the life of a person who wants to please God. The more we walk with him, the more we love him, the more we come to know him. Therefore, if we obey his commands, we know him. Obedience is tied to knowing God and loving him. Again, 1 John 2:5, he writes, "But if anyone obeys his word, God's love is truly made complete in him. This is how we know we are in him." This is the example of the obedient follower. The obedient man obeys God's word, knows God, and loves him. Remember the point. Jesus came to restore our relationship with God, to reveal God to humanity, to draw near so we can draw near to him, to restore our relationship. Therefore, to know God, we must draw near to Jesus and to follow the example that he left us. We must follow his teachings, and to follow his teachings is to obey them. And the more we obey his word and draw near to him and please him, the more we learn about him and we love him. Obedience isn't always easy, though, is it? It can be hard. And it's a discipline that we need to learn. So how do we learn obedience? I would encourage you, the first thing to do is pray and ask God for a desire to be obedient. Now you may be saying, well, that's obvious. Unfortunately, oftentimes we miss the things that are obvious. 1 John 5, he says, "This is the confidence we have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to his will," listen to that, "if we ask anything according to his will," and I think praying for a desire to be obedient would be according to his will. If we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have when we ask him. So pray, ask God for a desire to be obedient. Also, develop a love for the Word of God. Psalms 119:47, for I delight in your commands. Why? Because I love them. Part of our problem with obedience, we don't spend enough time in God's Word. So we don't know Him. Because we don't know Him, we don't know what He wants us to do. Practice the discipline of reading God's Word and let Him help you fall in love with it. And realize that to obey God often means it's like a head-on collision with human reasoning in the system of our world. Proverbs 1:7 tells us, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Oftentimes, doing what God wants you to do is very different than what the world would suggest you do, what the world expects you to do. There's a really good chance that when you decide to follow God and be obedient to God, it might not make sense to people around you. We also know that sometimes God will allow us to walk in the darkness. Things are going to be hard. We can learn to trust Him through those difficult times. In James 1:2-4, he tells us to consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance, and let that perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. And this is where many of us find ourselves today. We struggle right here because we don't know Him enough to really trust Him when it's dark, when things are hard. And this is where we find ourselves at the heart of comparison. Why am I here and they're there? But we do need to expect some inner struggles and failures. Paul reminds us in Romans 7, I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I don't do, but what I do is what I hate. An inner battle that wages on inside of us. If it was true for Paul, I believe it's true for us. Finally, we learn to leave the results of obedience to God. Proverbs 16, commit to the Lord whatever you do, and He will establish your plans. See, the Bible is very clear that if this is your desire and you commit it to God, you will succeed. I promise you. If you want God to answer prayer, pray that God will help you be obedient. Pray that God will help to give you a love for His Word. His Spirit, that same Spirit that emboldened Peter at Pentecost, dwells inside of you, helping you to have victory in this area. But I want you to ask yourself a few questions this morning. Are we sometimes guilty of looking around, comparing ourselves to other people, thinking, hey, that's not fair? How are you going to respond to Jesus' question? What is that to you? You follow me. Church, is there an area in your life where you can be honest and say, I have not been obedient? This has been a struggle. Is there something in your life that you need to confess that's holding you back, preventing you from submitting to the lordship of Jesus Christ? Let's pray together. God, we confess. It's hard not to look around and compare ourselves with other people. We admit today that doing that becomes a hindrance in our ability and our desire to follow you. God, we know the Scripture is clear. Father, because we say we love you, we need to obediently follow you. God, I thank you for not leaving us all alone, but you have given us the Holy Spirit. Fill us with your presence to help us be obedient followers of you. We want to be a people that follow you. And it's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.